Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 12 of Masks and Mimicry.
Yes.
Today, Brand and I are going to talk about creating a vampire character, continuing our series, and specifically talking about humanity, flaws, merits, and goals of your vampire character. We're kind of finally transitioning into actually talking about creating the vampire and not
Vampire.
the human stuff.
This is what our third
It is
in this
part
segment?
three.
Part three.
Part three of four. We kept saying it was going to be three parts, but we've decided to add a fourth part.
We've found a way.
Found a way to milk more out of Vampire the Masquerade. Um, so, welcome everybody. I do want to
Indeed.
start by talking about humanity, which is something I think doesn't get a lot of intentional focus when you're creating a character. I mean, it does get to a certain degree, but like within the books and everything, it's just like one page, just a little quick bloop with a chart, and you go down, you select your value. You don't even really get to customize it much. It's based on other scores, so
Right. Yeah.
there's
It's like
really
willpower plus something else, and
there's not like a lot of input you really even get to have in it unless you work with your storyteller to adjust, which sometimes you do. But I wanted to explain it real quick for people that aren't as intimately familiar with humanity and talk a little bit about why I think it's relevant. So, just to quickly recap humanity, it is essentially the moral path of your character for most vampire characters. Most people are on the path of humanity, which is essentially how humane and, human you are. It goes from like 1 to 10, and the if you get a score of like 1, you are a completely deranged beast and you can't even play that character. If you're a 10, you're like a saint. And it has basically a chart along that scale that has a list of different sins that are things that bother you or should bother you because of where your humanity is. For instance, for most people, killing someone would bother them and potentially lower their humanity if they do it too much.
yeah. Until the point in which you hit that score and it says this doesn't bother you anymore.
Yeah, you can kill people now and that doesn't bother you. It probably should, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
You're desensitized now. And that's not a thing just for vampires. Humans certainly have varying levels of humanity as well in the same regard. Now, I wanted to ask why it's relevant and kind of ask, because I do want y'all's thoughts on it as well. But for why I'm bringing it up, I think it's important because it does help to determine the moral compass of your character. It features into a lot of things we're going to talk about how you cope with flaws or what goals you might pursue. Because especially being that you're a monster of the night, your goals could be pretty terrible. But if it weren't for that humanity that you still have.
Yeah. Now, refresh me. Humanity, I believe, you mentioned like a 1 through 10 thing. The average vampire when you're creating this starts around 7?
7 or 8, usually.
7. Which becomes, I think, relevant at a certain point. But in general, humanity certainly helps with vampire being that it's usually in a city environment, lots of humans around. It really dictates how you start and continue to interact with that human nature that's all around you.
And
And it, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it can affect other roles and things as well, because if you have a really low humanity, that can be off putting to humans, that can bother them.
Yeah, there could be like a visual element to your character as you're just walking down the street that just emanates like that's weird, something's going on there.
Yeah, it's like when you see the one person that's creepy and you're pretty sure is a serial killer. Um, you're like,
You just got that
I don't.
vibe.
I got
Yeah,
that weird vibe. I don't like it.
cross the street, cross the street.
Yeah, as Grimslag said, having a saint character that was a hematology expert, delivering blood, it comes into play. Your humanity comes into play in many different aspects of your character, such as one of the main aspects for Vampire the Masquerade is determining, and really I probably should have included this in this topic today, is how you feed. And one of
Oh
the things
yeah,
I really like about the new fifth edition is they have a whole section based around how you feed. Older editions did not have this at all. It just
yeah.
really
I
left
don't
it up.
recall that.
It left it up to you entirely to kind of figure this out. And this book actually has like different types of social feeding and different types like you actually have to pick in there what type of hunting your character does, how they find
Interesting.
food, because it's a very specialized specific thing for your character. And I think we always kind of do that with our characters because you have to figure that out. Like, okay, what does my character do for sustenance? They seduce
Right.
people, or they go to clubs and they get people drunk, or whatever. And the book kind of codified that and was like, all right, here's how you here's where you identify what type of feeding your character generally does and how they sate this need, um,
That's
and
helpful. Yeah.
how you satisfy that is definitely kind of based on humanity, because if you have a high humanity, you certainly want to do something that's less harmful. You don't want to just jump someone in an alley, because that's one of the options. You're someone who mugs people and
Yeah.
attacks them, and that's not a very high humanity thing to do.
And it certainly comes into play with I believe it's one of the background options is a herd. If you put
Hmm.
points into that, it affects how you go about either obtaining that or how you manage it, and the whole process of that.
Yeah, and as Grimslag mentioned, this comes into the politics and the theater and the portrayal of the characters in many different ways, and specifically, high humanity has certain benefits to it. For instance, it can be easier to pass as human, but it also has some drawbacks because it limits the things you're willing to do. And that can be problematic when you're dealing with older kindred and stuff, people who are unscrupulous, who are going to really, try to hurt you or something. And you're like, well, I don't want to kill people. So, you get attacked by you get attacked by like some criminals or something that are working for someone else. Now, generally speaking, killing someone in self-defense is not considered an issue with humanity
Right.
unless you have very high humanity score. But it can
And
be.
that brings up an interesting point on the DM side of things when you're planning things to put against politically or even combat wise, just problems for your party to deal with. Those who have a higher humanity have more wiggle room for you to work against them to cause a drain of some sort. There's a lot more things that
Hmm.
they're uncomfortable with, a lot more things you can throw at them that becomes an issue for their humanity.
Absolutely. Um, Now, since it came up, I did actually want to deviate into feeding a little bit because I didn't think about that. But that is a good aspect, I think, of like not really character goals, but going to playing your vampire character a little bit, um, because that is a big aspect of the game is how you find uh, nourishment, and it's actually something
Right.
that I think the new fifth edition has emphasized more. Older editions is really up to your storyteller how much time you're going to spend on feeding, and um, I think the new fifth edition doesn't really try to encourage you to spend tons of time on it as much as it tries to make sure that you've quantified or you
Yeah.
have like a real idea of how you make sure that you have um, blood, and also
Right.
it kind of makes it a more valuable commodity as well with some of the new mechanics and systems they have. It's very easy to run out, um, or to run low and to get hungry and get risk frenzy, uh, and to make it kind of more of a regular issue instead of something where you're like, oh look, my tank's a little low, I better go fill her up. It definitely is a more prominent issue.
Indeed. And I think for like us, when we've just done the forum versions of it, or even some of the actual table settings of it, we kind of took it for granted. I think it's like, oh, we're in a club, like, hey, let's go get a thing of wine and blood. That's pretty common. We never really quantified the actual resource stock of it, like how much is there and where does it come from, and that would be an
Yeah.
interesting play, especially because vampire seems like it could be you could do like a resource management thing to it and actually keep track of all that and it would work well. versus some other systems it might detract from what you're doing.
And I think what they try to do now is they don't try to make it like a perpetual resource management sort of thing, because there's still lots of ways you can have to satisfy it. You can have a herd that you can feed off of. You know, someone who is wealthy can have a club, and they can have, you know, supplies brought in and stuff for people to sample. And in some ways, those are potential roles for people in a coterie to fulfill. You know, you're the rich guy who brings in all the blood. But they do.
Start,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say you could even start to throw in like a session or multiple sessions scattered throughout of trying to acquire it, and that becomes a thing.
Yeah, and that can be a group goal for a story arc, is getting more access to these, because they have also added some things that emphasize blood rarity as well, and that's where I think there is perhaps some management in there, because um, for typical blood, they just kind of want you to know how you're getting it, and then to kind of work that in to your character, into the character's personality, and fit that in. But then there are they basically added a feature where there's different types of blood based on person's kind of emotions and demeanor, and different vampires prefer different types of blood. I might prefer
Mm-hmm.
blood from someone who is kind of depressed and or sleepy all the time. That's just kind of my thing. It gives me a good feel. Or
There happens to be a flaw dedicated to deciding that.
or might like blood from someone who is terrified or angry. Um, and so those are kind of new mechanics they've added in the new edition that I think emphasize some cool character building traits for your character. Like, even if you're not using fifth edition, there are some mechanics in it that I think are really good for possibly porting into older editions and looking at
Nice.
and going like, well, that's really cool. So let's just bring, even though we're going to use V20, let's pull that back. Let's see. So one thing I did want to talk about, going back to humanity briefly, before moving on to flaws and merits, was how do you feel about humanity and nature and demeanor versus alignment? We had a whole episode talking about alignment.
Who? Uh, we did. I mean, humanity's a and kind of an all-encompassing look on a very specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
Versus alignment can oftentimes be vague. It's split obviously into law, order, good and evil, or law and chaos, or order and chaos, good and evil, which can be specific but still vague within those. There's a lot of interpretation to what is chaotic, what is order, and different things can fall into those. Humanity, it seems very personal, as we are humans and we have our own humanity in real life and how we treat other people, and that kind of plays into what we know about it, and it's kind of just a definitive path.
Yeah.
What is morally acceptable, what is not. Even though we're playing a game, we know that there are things we're doing in this game that we would never do in real life. And so there's a fine definite line, I should say, of what is cool and not cool.
Yeah, I actually kind of wish like D&D and a number of other tabletop games had a more World of Darkness esque morality structure instead of the alignment system. I do find the alignment system to be annoyingly vague. Like, it has its use, as I kind of argued in that episode. It has its uses, but I feel like it's overly vague for new players, and yet kind of annoyingly, it can be easy to misperceive in a way that can be annoying for experienced players. Like, for newer players, just, oh, well, it's chaotic good. Okay, what does that mean? It either gives them a very specific, almost stereotypical perception, or it doesn't really fully explain what it is for real new players. But then for
Yeah.
experienced players, it gives other people perceptions of what their characters might be that might be faulty, um, based on just this very loose alignment system.
Yeah. I like the demeanor aspect and the nature aspect being completely separate things from the system.
Yeah.
I mean, intertwined with humanity, in that humanity is your overall morality level, general. You kind of probably don't do this, do this, and then your demeanor and your nature are, this is who you really are. This is how you present yourself with your demeanor or your nature. This is inside, if you're presenting something different than that, who you actually are. And you can kind of, you pick a broad path and then you pick a specific path after that.
Yeah, and that's very much what I think would work in other games. And Grim wanted us to expand on the morality issue. I think that D&D and other tabletop games, they would have to be different. It couldn't be the exact same system, but I do think that having a morality tree isn't a crazy idea to have for like D&D and stuff, because it's very frequently a problem where players turn into murder hobos and they start doing things that you're like, is this really good? And I think the problem is that alignment tries to smash a behavioral system with a morality system into one just label.
It's too broad.
It's a little too broad and vague. They try to say, okay, well, because if you think about it, lawful versus chaotic is both a value statement and also kind of a behavioral statement. And then good and evil is more of a value statement, but still also a little bit of a behavioral statement. And they should be maybe separated in different ways. And I like that Vampire has essentially the humanity tree as your morality tree. This is how moral you are from a human being standpoint. Typical human values on killing and theft and this sort of stuff. Yeah. This is where you're at. What you do and what you won't do. And then you have nature and demeanor. You have your nature, which is the true essence of who you are, what type of person you are, how you would behave if no one was looking at you. And then demeanor is the type of person you portray to other people. And I don't think that system necessarily fits perfectly into like fantasy games like D&D and stuff, because it's less about secrecy. It's less about manipulation and stuff. But I do think something similar could still be easily fit into there, because everybody has a real self that they don't really show that much. And so I think maybe for like D&D or something, they could have like a nature and demeanor traits system or something where it's like, that's not necessarily like, this is how you act and this is how you really are, like it is with Vampire, but more like, okay, this is more of like a private trait that you don't really exude as much, whereas this is more of like a public trait that you do.
I feel like they may have tried to do that, and we're slightly off topic on that. They may have tried to do that with the backgrounds element of 5th edition, and to kind of start to incorporate that, but that's all really optional stuff compared to morality in Vampire the Masquerade is mechanical and matters heavily to the choices you make and the choices the DM makes against you.
Yeah, and we are a little off topic with it, but I just wanted to kind of, while we were talking about humanity, I was like, I want to kind of deviate into it a little bit, because I think it's an interesting
other systems could do well with something similar.
Or at least take some notes from it and build some things in a little bit.
It's fun.
So let's talk about flaws. In Vampire the Masquerade, you have physical, mental, and social flaws that, as well as physical, mental, and social merits. Flaws being flaws, character flaws, problems with your character, and merits being extra bonuses that you get.
Indeed.
So how do you, for chat and for you, how do you generally go about choosing your flaws?
Indeed. It should be noted that the flaws and merits are a point-based system. Per the rules, you're allotted a certain amount of points. I think it's 10, a combination of 10 points between like merits and flaws. 10. Yeah, merits consume flaws, merits consume points, flaws give you points. They kind of balance each other out to an extent.
And it is kind of an optional system, like not all storytellers use it.
You could just play the game without taking any. So there's some limitations, but it becomes a mechanical thing as well, trying to min-max your character to get some merit benefit versus some of the flaws, almost like a Banes and Boons thing. But I go about typically I haven't, and I actually thought about it today. On the next time I play is kind of what I'll base this off of, what I would do. And I would actually start to pick flaws and merits that are ones that support both the past and future story rather than personification elements of the characters. There are things in there like common sense, which is mostly just RP flavor stuff. I would kind of skip those, go past those, and go to ones that mechanically affect the things you do,
Common
and can
sense
come
is
up
really good
later.
for new players, though,
It is
because it
super
lets the
good.
storytellers lean in and go, "Do you really want to do that?"
Yeah, but there are ones that heavily affect the way you play in the interactions you're dealing with, and I would go straight for those ones. And there are a lot of them that do that, but they're ones that usually involve connections with
Mm-hmm.
NPCs, connections with organizations, having some shady past connection elements, lots of connection stuff. Kind of going back to the touchstone things we talked about, but
Yeah.
really emphasizing it.
Yeah, for me, I try to pick them based on a combination of what I think will generate good role play, and what I think will make things challenging to certain degrees. What adds more challenge to some of the goals and things that I want to do. Um, and I admit sometimes, and to some extent, it's for points because there's a
Yeah.
merit or something I want, and so I find a flaw I want
Ugh,
because I want
it's
points.
3 points. I gotta find a flaw worth
Yeah.
3 points.
Um, I do think that you can really do yourself a disservice by trying to focus too much in min maxing in
Mm-hmm.
any game, but especially in Vampire. But to some extent, it's like, "Ugh, I want that thing. I need the points for it." Especially
Yeah.
if it's like a merit that you really want, and you're like, "I need the points to buy it."
And that's where I would recommend for anyone starting and looking to not min max is ignore merits first and foremost. Look at all the flaws first and pick flaws. And then be like, oh, well, that just gave me some points. Let's see if there's a merit that first and foremost doesn't counteract a flaw you just took, but does something else completely that seems in line with what you've already thought about. Uh, don't start with merits because then you get into that backtracking mode, like you just said, of trying to just balance it out with points at the end.
There's nothing wrong with getting laid in Vampire. I mean, that happens. Um, with some degree of difficulty, but at least in the acting out portion in story, not
As
the
long as
role
your
play acting
Toreador
out portion.
clan flaw doesn't come into play while that's happening, you're good.
um, but yeah, I think that's a good idea. Really, starting with merits starting with
Or
flaws before you look
flaws.
at merits, because there are a lot of really tempting merits, especially for people
So
that do
many.
like to min max and stuff, which we all do to some extent. Um, and there are some in there that are so good. There are ones that every time I make a character, I'm like, oh, I want that merit. I'm not gonna get it, but I kind of want it. It's so good.
Yeah.
And so, do you have any favorite merits or flaws, things you've used
Merits.
before
I
or really
have.
wanted to that?
Uh indeed. Excuse me. For flaws, I actually have a list of flaws here that I've looked at. And one I've actually taken a few times is the rival sires flaw.
Mhm.
Um and the typically the Tremere have a clan curse that they have to eat of a certain type of blood. There's a flaw that does that as well for non-Tremere players, and I've taken that a
Oh,
few
you mean
times as
the
well.
Ventru flaw?
Sorry, the Ventru. It's
I
been a
was
while.
confused for a moment. I was like, huh?
Not the Tremere. But yeah, the so rival sires and then the prey exclusion is what it's called.
Yeah.
Um, to limit, especially if you're playing fifth edition, it sounds like that becomes more of a thing for you.
Let's see. Graham mentioned first strike. I'm not sure what that is. Um, off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with it. For me, I have three that kind of stand up as ones I've used. And actually, all three of these I think are with the same character. Um, first is sanguinary animism, which is the flaw, the kind of a mental flaw, where when you feed off of people, you think that you are actually drinking their souls as opposed to not just their blood, but you are actually feeding on their soul. So if you kill someone while feeding on them, you actually think that you consume their
Diablerized them.
soul. Um, and take it into your body. Um, then there is Code of Honor, which is
Sounds familiar.
a helpful merit that actually kind of helps to reinforce your humanity and kind of protect it to a little bit, because you have a certain moral code that you have set up, and you will not you will not, you know, act out of that code, and so it kind of helps you with maintaining your code. And for instance, if you frenzy, you can actually get a check to resist certain actions if they violate your code of honor. Um, and the last one is true love. Having a generally a mortal, it doesn't have to be a mortal necessarily, but generally a mortal individual that your character is genuinely in love with. A lot of vampires think they're in love, but
Yes.
you're generally in love with them.
I've taken that one and combined it with the hunted flaw, and that person was the same person for both.
Uh, so I did want to also ask, how, if they did it all, how do any of those you feel tie into humanity?
uh let's see. Looking at, especially with the prey exclusion, can certainly come into play in that, we've talked about that moment you turn is usually a moment where you lose something,
Hmm.
your life changes, there's a huge shift in things, and it's not unreasonable to say you come out of that with some mental issues going on with you,
To some
that
extent, yeah.
could certainly derive from your human social life previously, and prey exclusion would come into that play. And like, maybe you had a really really good friend that when you turned is now dead through that process, and you can't feed on whatever the type of that person was, whether it's a certain blood type that that person had, and it kind of starts coming into play with how you viewed people.
Hmm.
You can tie it very closely to that, at least.
Yeah, there could be different types. Prey exclusion could definitely come in for different things, because there may be moral reasons why you won't feed on certain people. It's revolting to you. Like a pretty common one is children, having like prey exclusion children. I won't feed on kids. Well, okay.
Yeah. Something that was in your human life so morally like clear, like you just don't do this thing, that it
Hmm.
carried over into a prey exclusion flaw.
Do not think that turning is the same as drug addiction. I think in some ways it is. And actually, that's something that, like I've mentioned before, the new 5th edition plays up hunger and blood and everything a lot more, and very actively portrays it much more as an addiction. Um, Kind of almost blatantly so. Like, they're like, you're addicted to feeding blood. You must do it. You must have it. You're jonesing for it. And they do kind of play that up a lot, which is why, if you don't take care of yourself and you don't feed, eventually you'll do anything to feed, and you will violate your morals in order to do that. Um, so, that is something that definitely comes into play for me and my merits and flaws that I mentioned. They all actually have some sort of tie to humanity. For instance, sanguinary animism, I mentioned taking flaws that create challenge. In this case, that makes it very challenging, because this was a character who had a reasonably high humanity score. Um, and so having this mental issue where he thinks if he kills someone, it's by feeding on them, he drains their soul. That just makes it that much worse for him. And also, he was kind of orchestrated to have to kill people. So he was kind of intentionally put in a very, very tough position, where he had to go through very difficult means to feed and not kill people. Code of honor helps to reinforce the humanity system, kind of helps to protect it a little bit, to kind of fight some of that stuff. And all three of these are actually from the same character, so he's have one thing that makes it harder, but then something else that kind of makes it a little bit easier in certain circumstances to hold on to that humanity. And then similarly, true love helps to reinforce humanity, helps to protect it for a while. But there's the thing with vampires, they grow older, and their mortal
Mm-hmm.
counterparts very much, or they don't grow older, and their mortal counterparts very much do, and eventually die, and or are at great risk. And so it only helps for so long before it really becomes I think, inevitably a detriment.
Yes. And rival sire, as I mentioned, not exactly like towards your own personal humanity score necessarily, but can bring up dealing with human emotions, and rival sires being this kind of jealousy thing between two people higher up than you,
Yeah.
and often interacting with you and creating some unknown loyalty issues that you have to deal with. That could pit you up against your own human score, but mostly just dealing with their kind of humanity level.
Absolutely. Let's see. Grimm's mentioned, saw a documentary on heroin users and how they will do anything to get their next dose regardless of safety. And I do think that, the drug addiction analogy is very apt and is kind of the intent of Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire's use of or feeding on blood. I mean, even the popular game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines kind of opens up with it, with one of the NPCs, literally, uh, declaring that blood is your new drug. Um, and you have to keep feeding on it, or you will do anything to get it if you neglect it. And sometimes it can be interesting to play characters that flirt with that in different ways, from whether it's a character like my Dark Ages character who had actual flaws that made it very difficult to feed, or you have people who have moral issues that make it difficult to feed, people who might resist feeding for as long as possible because they don't want to
Yeah.
violate their morals, but then at the same time that actually puts them at greater risk of doing so because they may end up killing someone.
And that can certainly be a narrative choice, as to know that you're going to do it eventually, and to just try to put it off as long as you can, and then see when it comes up that you actually do it and how you respond to that.
And of course it's directly tied into combat and other systems of the
Yeah,
game because all your powers and everything are fueled by blood.
for
So
sure. It's encouraged you don't go as long as you can without doing it.
it very much is. So let's transition a little bit to character goals. Um,
Yes.
these can, and I think should, vary wildly with character, of course. Every character has a different humanity score, every character has a different background and origin. Um, what are some main overarching character goals that you've had, that you've used for characters?
Well, I think there's one important one that everyone should share, and that's don't die. Um,
Generally.
survive is the goal.
And
As
it's
long as you
actually,
can.
and that's actually a really good point because I feel like many or most of your, depends on your character, but many or most of your character's goals come from that goal, not to
Yeah.
die. You're trying to thrive, you're trying to live, and your goals are things that should help you do that.
Yeah. Um oh man. I haven't really been too keen, or I wouldn't say keen, too invested into goals with what little I've played.
It's been
Um
a while since we've played Vampire.
and it's been a while since we've actually played. The one character I did have, there was more some superfluous goals of trying to, this was our Dark Ages campaign, of trying to completely win over the prince who had hired us as trust to eventually become like a harpy type character for him as a toreador. um, all the while managing the more butler-esque elements
Mm-hmm.
of the setting we were in, which was, I think we were given like a keep that we had to manage, and there was a thing involved. So I kind of set myself, my goal was to establish that and run that whole element, and eventually gain the prince's trust enough to be like a harpy for him.
Yeah, I think power and or influence are never superfluous choices. Those are very common but very valid goals in Vampire. Um, yeah, they do help you survive. if you
They do.
if you are useful, if you have a place and you are useful, it's harder to kill you.
The
Um,
the initial method I was going for was more superfluous than that. I was a musician, so I was like trying to get that going and become like a court musician for the prince, and then
Yeah.
work my way up from there.
Um, for me, I have three, which actually come from three different characters. And I'm thinking of core overarching goals, kind of staying away from like little minor short term goals. I have one character whose goal was to cure himself.
It's a good one.
And these tie into back into humanity as well, because he has a goal to cure himself. This was a high humanity character. So my Dark Ages character again. He was a fairly high humanity character. His goal, he wanted to not be a vampire. He saw himself as a fiend, a demon that should not exist, and all the rest of their colleagues as demons who he would gladly destroy. And for some of them anyway, could.
Yeah,
He was
probably.
very much the melee the fighter character of the group. But that freaking code of honor that stays his blade every time. But his goal, he wanted to cure himself. Then there was my Anarch character who wanted to destroy the Camarilla. Quite literally wanted to destroy the Camarilla. And as I was plotting these notes out for this, I realized in V5, it's almost like my character succeeded, because our setting for that, our pre World of Darkness MMO setting for that took place in like Oregon, which all of that is now Anarch territory in V5, because the Anarchs finally completely broke away from the Camarilla and just shattered the Camarilla in this area. And I'm like, that's really what my character wanted to do. That was kind of their whole motivation. And because that character was a lower humanity character, was really more of an elder who had a very substantially lower humanity, so the goal was purely selfish. They just wanted to do it out of revenge. They wanted to smash the Camarilla out of hatred of some of the princes. That's it. And the person was genuinely an anarchist, not an anarch, but an anarchist. Masquerading as an anarch.
Yeah.
And then the last one, a venture I made more recently, just wanted to climb the Ventrue ladder of power. Just wanted more power and influence.
Of course.
And he had a reasonably lower humanity, but not like super low. So he was more in like the 6 range. He was a little bit older because he'd been a ghoul for a long time, but that was his goal, was much more kind of standard and mundane. He wants more power and authority, and he wants to be recognized as, and that was his big thing, was being recognized as someone of influence. And so,
yeah, interesting. I in talking with Sarah here in chat, I remembered I did, in fact, own a demon, an imp, that was kind of a helpful method to try to gain the power or to climb the ladder up to the prince and become a harpy-esque like character. And that actually ties into humanity, in that I was willing to kill people to give their souls to the imp in return for the blood from them and the power that comes from it and his services.
I still get sad that we didn't get further into that game, in large part because there were so many things like that, like a friend of ours character who was a Zamitsi and was very invested in creating terrible ghouls from people, and then like your character having like a demon, and I'm sitting there like, if my character finds out any of this, he will try to kill them. Like, what are you doing? If he finds this out, he's going to be furious. He's going to go off the rails.
One of my first introductory, probably my very first introductory to Vampire the Masquerade, I would do everything differently and maybe pull from some of the concepts, but in a much more equatable way, where the group setting isn't so at odds with each other completely. There's certainly going to be that, but just more feasible, well put together.
Yeah,
thought.
that game we didn't have like a solid session zero or anything to really build like the group cohesiveness or anything. And that is the thing. Like Vampire, your party member, your coterie members are gonna be antagonistic to some degree. They are gonna butt
Hmm.
heads and possibly have goals that run contrary to each other. But ultimately, they should have a overarching goal that is the same. They should have some kind of core focus for why they're together. Besides, people
Yeah,
told us to be. Um, even if it's literally we hate each other, but we can't afford to not be together because other people will destroy us.
yeah,
There needs to be some kind of a reason. Otherwise, why are you working together? You just gonna end up killing each other. Um,
indeed. And there can be personal goals in tons and tons of personal goals, whether it's vampire related or even human related. You can have goals on both sides of that morality.
yeah, that's the thing. I do think that humanity ties to a lot of these things in interesting ways, but I don't think that's necessarily essential. For why you're picking goals and stuff. Um, I don't think you have to constantly be thinking about it. I just think it's an avenue, an interesting perspective to put on some of these aspects. And my last question I have,
Yeah.
uh, Sarah wishes she could remake her. I was thinking the other week, my character Seven, which was the one that was kind of an elder and real low humanity,
Hmm.
everything. There's a part of me that would love to remake that character as like a neonate for something, just similar philosophy and character concept, but then updated as like a neonate instead of being like the storyteller character um, that
Yeah.
they were. Um,
Eventually, we'll do a reimagining, I'm sure, of characters one day.
I gotta play actual VTM first. It's been a while.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. We would play
Gotta have
in
time.
possibly a reimagining of characters.
Let's see, but
Last question.
how do you brainstorm those goals?
Mm.
How do you come up with the goals in the first place for characters? And we of course talked about this in D&D,
Yeah,
but for people who aren't sure how to start building out and fleshing out those character goals that they want to have.
I mean, I certainly think looking to humanity as your trait is a good starting point because it reflects and affects the progress forward. Like if you're humanity 7 or 6 or 5, like you have to decide how you feel about it as a vampire. Super super important. How do I feel about this? And then what am I trying to get with this new life? What are the things happening around me? What This is where I'm at, and where am I going? Because you have nothing but time or death. Time or death is your situation there. And so you have to decide what you're doing with that time and where you're going with it. But start at how do I feel about this and then work from there.
Yeah, I think looking at humanity is really important because at the very least it sets limits to what your goals can be.
Yeah.
If you want to play a character who is still fairly moral, there's obviously going to be limits on what you're willing to do, and that might shape what some of your goals are ultimately. Um, I also think that I forgot what I was going to say. I had a thing. It was oh, um, I actually think that in some ways people portray, and I've done it here in this episode, portray new vampire characters in a way that's misleading for people who are new to Vampire the Masquerade. By saying, hey, you're now a bloodthirsty monster. And while that's true, um, I actually think it's more useful, especially for newer Vampire the Masquerade players, to say, look, you are a person who has had something happen to them, and they are now addicted to blood, and they must drink it, and they must potentially hurt people to do that.
And
Now,
not get caught.
and not get caught, or they will be killed. And they've been put in this organization where they must be secretive, they must be sneaky. Now, what are your goals? What are you
Yeah.
thinking about? What do you do with this? Do you have help? Do you have support? Go back to your backstory, not necessarily your human backstory, but your vampire backstory you started writing with, where your sire is, that is, and look at it and go, okay, what did they do to turn me? And now I'm not suddenly a monster. I'm a person who has to do something that's really kind of bad. And how do I rationalize that in my mind? Because that's a
Right.
very different way to look at it, I think, than just going, all right, you're a monster. Now, what are your goals?
Yeah. And typically as a neonite with a sire, and the sire has a sire, possibly still alive, and maybe even that sire has a sire, maybe still alive or still present. You're a pawn for the most part. You and maybe you have a conversation with the DM, and maybe you know some of your sire's intentions with you, maybe you don't. But if you do start asking those questions, why did my sire sire me? What is my sire's goal? And is that also now my goal to some extent? Or is my goal to not be part of that goal and start working with the characters around you? We talked about theater somewhere in chat. Grimslag mentioned like there are actors all around you. Look at them. They're NPCs mostly, but see what they want and see what you want from them and where it leads.
And I think some of it comes from kind of to run somewhat contrary to what chat is talking about, somewhat. Um, you have to look at your session zero. You have to look at your group goals, your story setting. What is the group trying to achieve? How does your character fit in with that? And talk to the storyteller. Now, I do agree that you shouldn't make a character and then have the storyteller shouldn't be coming in telling you to act a different way or act a certain way. But I do think that you should have a conversation with the storyteller about what your character's goals are. And as part of that, it being a conversation, it's a two-way communication. They're going to give some input, you're going to give some input, you're going to swap ideas. Ultimately, the decision is up to you. But I do think that there should be some kind of dialogue there, because the storyteller has to tell you whether or not certain things are feasible,
Mm-hmm.
come up with ideas for how they work in the setting. um, you may suggest a goal, and then the storyteller's like, I don't know how that's going to work in the story. Like, that's not going to come up at all. And then do you really want to do that? Or, you can then decide you still want to have it as your character's core goal, but knowing it's probably not going to come up in the story at all.
Yeah. With not without forcing it. And at that point, you at least want to try to lead a little bit, like maybe do something more like that this might get a little more use out of it. You certainly don't want to give the impression that their goal is perfectly capable of happening and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And that's something that it's off the topic of vampire, but I've been looking at some Call of Cthulhu stuff lately and prepping that, and there was an interesting note that I was reading about character skills, and this as the keeper, which is their term for storyteller in that system. If a player takes a skill that's not going to come up in the game, you should maybe tell them, hey, take a different skill that is not going to come up. You can still keep it if you want, but I'm telling you, we're not going to use that skill at all, so you probably want to invest it elsewhere.
Yeah,
And so it's a
that's
similar
fair.
kind of thing. Like, if you're the storyteller, you know what you want to cover. And if someone talks about going into something that you're like, I don't want to, I don't know if that's really going to come up, or that I can even do with that, it's too far afield. I think it's a good thing to tell them, so that they can go, maybe I want to rethink that and focus on something else that can actually fit in the story.
Yeah. Um, and I would say when you're thinking about your goals, try to think of one that perceivably can actually be achieved, even if you don't do it. Um, Not that you don't do the goal, but that you try to achieve it and you fail. That's
Mm-hmm.
okay. But one that you think realistically can actually be achieved
Or
as well. So you have something to work towards and the satisfaction of possibly actually doing it.
And I think you should have short-term and long-term goals, because you don't necessarily need to achieve all your goals. In fact, you shouldn't. You should have goals that you're not going to necessarily achieve in the story, but you can at least work towards. You
Yeah.
can achieve progress towards those, and especially long-term goals are great for that. That you start chipping away at them, you start working towards them over the length of a story. and you may not finish it. Like, and sometimes goals can be impossible. I do think it's okay to pick a goal that out of character is impossible. For instance, I made an anarchist character who wanted to destroy the Camarilla, knowing well, like, there's no way that happens. That doesn't happen. You can't just destroy the Camarilla, even if you are an elder. That's not going to happen. But I'm like, that makes sense for the character. They hate them, they want them gone, they want them destroyed, and they're going to actively work towards things that push towards that impossible goal.
Indeed. And Sarah mentions in chat, it's a very true statement, that goals can be fluid and
Yeah.
are almost always fluid because there are external forces affecting your goals that you have no control of.
For sure. And I think actually sometimes in certain games like D&D, they're more fluid than they are in like Vampire, because the characters are kind of timeless, so you can almost always circle back in some way if you survive long enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, they definitely do change. The things you're looking for definitely alter. And I think that's actually a really good sign of character growth as you're playing your characters, that your goals change. Because they might change because they become impossible or really difficult. But more often than not, I feel like they change because your character changes to some extent.
You've perceived something that has affected the way you look at your goal or things that involve your goal, and suddenly your goal is now representative of that outlook.
Yeah, you've got a new perspective. Something is suddenly more important than whatever that thing was previously. For instance, our D&D game that you've been running, my character had some short-term goals that they were working towards, or they had intended to work towards, and some of them have dramatically taken a backseat because they're just not that important anymore.
Yeah. I've waited for some of those things to happen, and I very much encourage it, but just
I've been looking for opportunities. Like, I was literally one of them. I was planning to start going around paying money for it. I will pay you to give me your blood, but but yeah, it's just like, you know what? Don't even care anymore. This is not gonna happen now.
That's okay.
Because priorities,
Priorities. And you walk in with a goal, Vampire, D&D, whatever, thinking one thing, and a DM usually integrates part of the one thing, but now there's something else. There's a twist, as they say. And it becomes a whole new thing to deal with that you weren't expecting, ideally.
So, were there any other things that you wanted to talk about in these kind of around these areas? Those were all my questions.
Well, we talked about humanity.
Yeah.
And we haven't really in any of these segments, and maybe we'll do it in the fourth one, not sure, get into clans, but some clans are
Definitely in the
more
fourth one.
capable and more pushed through the narrative of the books and the rules towards being a little more human, or towards being a little further away from humanity, that you should consider when deciding your human level, even prior to the turning point, your humanity, your overall character, like how human of a character do you want to play, and that might influence a clan choice as well.
Yeah, that's actually our very next topic. So
there you go. Nice segue. See you in 2 weeks for that one.
So we, as I mentioned earlier, we have decided there's going to be a 4-part series. We have one more left because in 2 weeks we want to talk about playing different vampire clans, talking about what are some of the typical ways to play them, and what are some ways you can break out of that mold, kind of portray a different sort of Vintru or Bruja or Zemitzi or whatever the case may be. So we're going to look at the main clans, the core traditional clans. I'm not going to get into all the crazy spin-off clans, because
there are so many details for each. So
yeah, and we're just going to kind of hit them and talk about some of the different some of the different options, some of the different takes and perspectives you can have on them, and when you go to make your character, what you can think about. So thanks everybody for hanging out. Thanks for coming
Yeah.
to episode 12. We'll have episode 13 in 2 weeks.
Clans.
Talk about clans. And remember, if it's a D10, it's probably not a mimic.